Welcome back, everyone. We're doing another episode of Indie Reads Aloud. We are halfway through season 3. So, welcome back, and I'm glad you guys are sticking with us and discovering new authors as I do as well. Today, Joseph Williams is joining us. Hi, Joseph.
Hello.
Thanks for coming. Joseph is a new to me author. I have not read your work yet, but I'm really excited to hear a little bit of it. This is how I build my TBR pile, by listening to authors come on the program and tell me a little bit about their work. So thank you
Yeah.
for
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to do this.
it's super fun. I have a good time. For those of you like me who don't know Joseph very well, I stole his bio from his website. So I'm going to share that with you now. Joseph Williams is an author of science fiction, fantasy, literary fiction, and horror who has published 10 novels, 4 short story collections, and 1 essay. He graduated from Wayne State University with a master's degree in creative writing. His work has been anthologized alongside New York Times bestselling authors and Stoker Award winners, such as Clive Barker, Jonathan Maberry, Tim Waggoner, Harlan Ellison, and Jack Ketchum. Those are some great company to keep.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's very cool. Joseph lives in Farmington Hills, Michigan, with his wife and 3 daughters. How did you get to be in these amazing anthologies? I mean, how were you selected to? How did you
Well,
even start to think about submitting for those?
I was very fortunate actually. I worked with a independent press out of Cincinnati that's unfortunately now defunct. And they were putting these anthologies together, and I had published 4 books with them, and they just invited me to submit and selected my stories, and I was very very lucky. I got some reviews from that from like Horror Hound magazine and Bloody Disgusting, which is a a renowned horror website.
Sure.
So that was a really good stepping stone for me to get my name out there, and I
Yeah, I
was
mean,
really fortunate.
when you can partner your name with people like Clive Barker, I mean, that's nothing better for your marketing platform than that kind of a resume.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Congratulations on that. That's very,
Thank
very
you.
cool. Today you're going to read from your book Colt, which is science fiction. And for anyone who is listening who may have little ears present, maybe sitting in the back seat of the car or hanging out while you're folding the laundry, we have a listener advisory for some violence in this book. So you might want to preview this episode before you share it with the little ears in your life. Tell us, Joseph, about this book. Give us a quick synopsis of what's going on in this story.
Absolutely. So the main character, his name is Nuri, and he is a holy warrior. Basically, he was taken from his family when he was young and sort of groomed to be part of this religious army. And now he's undergoing something called the trials to determine whether he transforms into this sort of supernatural being called Hidria, that carries out God's will in the universe. And so during the trials, he's given a hallucinogenic drug, and basically has an entity named Colt who's guiding him through the process. And you don't know if she's an adversary or someone helping him through the process because she's challenging him a lot. And his goal is to find God in the universe. And so I'm going to read the first couple of chapters to get a sense of how disoriented he is in the beginning and his first exposure to Colt.
So, would it be accurate to say that this book is Christian science fiction,
It is
or is it a religious questioning science fiction?
it's a little bit of both. It's definitely got a Christian bent to it, and it definitely believes in the existence of God and sort of questions the institutions of religions and forceful conversions and things like
That's
that.
going to be a cool combination. I'm
Yeah,
excited to hear what that sounds like. I love meeting new authors because you get new stories in new ways all the time. That's what I love about stories. So I'm super excited. When you are ready, please take the microphone and read aloud.
absolutely. Thank you. It began in darkness, a hollow projector sighed to life on a platform overlooking a deep, shimmering pool, the Great Colt. She was more imposing than he'd imagined, indifferent, hands crossed behind her back, shallow mouth barely moving even as she began to speak. Her stare burned through his skull as though she were truly standing in front of him rather than a universe away, ready to pass judgment or lend a helping hand. Like God, like Colt. An indistinct form, a voice, a shadow. You are surrounded by microscopic poisonous creatures. The human body cannot withstand more than 27 seconds among them, 16 in a cloud of this concentration. You've already inhaled their toxic breath. A human will be dead within 10 seconds. Her eyebrows rose slightly. They showed neither malice nor benevolence. They were simply elevated. You, therefore, must not be human. He couldn't find the voice to respond. His senses were awash in the emergent spectacle, gaseous shadows illuminated by the wavering twinkle of the hologram over the pool. Searing pain as the creatures bit into his esophagus and lungs. The end. Staring down death through a long, lonely corridor. A kaleidoscope of colorful pain reflected in her eyes, and she withdrawn to clinical observation as though she didn't care whether he lived or died. Perhaps she didn't. I am not human, he thought, scrambling to remember his training, regulating his breath the way the Nuri masters had taught him high in the mountains on a dark, rainy day that had seemed to last forever. You will die because you do not know God. It was not the accusation he'd expected, but the sacred manual had warned him to be prepared for improvisation. 1 out of every 5 called warriors was dealt a change in the ritual, and evidently he was that one. He wondered if the designation should be a source of pride or concern. Pride dwells in the tongue of the dead man. A nonsensical saying, perhaps, but one which had been sufficiently drilled into his head between the manual and the Nuri teachings to be sacred in its own perverse way. It stuck to the roof of his brain like salta butter and wouldn't budge no matter how hard he tried to drive it out through meditative exercises. This is nothing like I expected, he thought futilely, praying that the great Colt hadn't spotted the hopelessness creeping over his face. I will die before reaching the end. You will die either way. Again, she probed his thoughts, reaching in with hooked fingernails and peeling apart his insecurities to examine on her throne at the end of all realities. Time was running out. There's no such thing as time, she countered. Another seemingly nonsensical saying that boasted profundity while never quite achieving it. Part of the test. Part of seeing what he was made of and whether he had the intellect to wade through the illusions and archaic chants of his religion to find a greater truth than any living creature had ever known. I can do this, he reminded himself. He was one of the called, after all, a solemn charge awarded to precious few. If he succeeded in the trials, he would inherit the mantle of the most revered warriors in the universe, the enlightened purveyors of justice and truth who served the great Colt in her infinite wisdom. He would become Hidria. But for now, he was going to die. You must not die, Colt told him. You must not be human. Steeling himself, he breathed deeply of the toxins and surrendered his body to helplessness despite the searing pain. Pain, after all, was human, and he could not allow it to take hold of him in this strange new world. I cannot show weakness. His blood boiled as the creatures wormed through his veins. A gasp escaped his lips before he could draw it back into his lungs. Yet Colt did not appear behind him with her fiery sword, nor did she stab him through the heart and spit on his corpse as the manual had said she might at the first sign of unworthiness. So he assumed he was still in the running, still malleable in her estimation. I am not human, he reminded himself. I am Hydria. The moment the thought entered his mind, the sense of poison in his body faded and ecstasy consumed him as completely as death. The contrast was too overwhelming to effectively process. His brain began to overload. You are not human, Colt said firmly. The platform disappeared and he was suddenly kneeling in a thick jungle before a thundering waterfall. The sky was a psychedelic swirl of purples, blues, and greens. The wind blew hair softly across his forehead. You are Hidria, reborn at the hands of the great Colt. Not by my hands, she corrected him, but by your own. By your own and by God's. Nothing can be done without God. But I don't know God. If you survive, you will. Humans cannot know God, but you are Hydria. You are the called. This was entirely different. The landscape shifted beneath him, and he was suddenly in deep space with no visible planets or stars and no spacesuit for life support. You will know God or you will die. The great Colt appeared before him once again, but her face was now a rotting skull with maggots squirming through her eyes and mouth. This is how we all must appear, he thought, not knowing why. A whole new universe had opened to his mind, and he needed only to endure this peculiar cosmic suffering to attain it. A trial more terrible than any battlefield or enemy dungeon imagined in the most corrupt minds of the troubled galaxies. A sonic prayer called from his cries of agony, and the hope that the God of the universe would not turn a blind eye to him in his time of need. I do not know God. Eyes bulging, heart stopping, skin freezing and slowing off. Or maybe that was just his imagination. Maybe it was all a trick, an effect of the sacred drugs he'd ingested prior to the calling. It felt real, though. It felt like his soul had been ripped from his body and stuffed into an insidious celestial womb that would inevitably strangle him stillborn. He would be cleansed. He would be Hydria or he would die. I cannot die. Hydria do not die. Suddenly he was seated before a long stone hallway with a laser sword in his right hand and the severed head of the evil one in his left. There was no way in or out as far as he could see, only forward. The trials begin, he thought. Already he could hear the murmur of some wretched beast deep within the winding corridors. Already he felt his constitution shifting within him as though his body were tearing itself apart and rebuilding for a nobler occupation. To know God, and thereby know the universe. To die and be reborn as the most feared and revered warrior across the galaxies. To be Hydria. You must not be human. He inhaled deeply and allowed his mind to settle into the transformation. The first watchman appeared before he'd taken 10 steps down the hall, and that was sooner than they usually arrived. He already sensed how the stakes had been raised for his trials, and once again he didn't know whether to feel pride or despair. Shadows rippled off the turquoise walls, hinting at a liquid luminescence nearby that was otherwise hidden. Another subtle illusion designed to distract him from the truth. I am not human, he reminded himself. Distraction is human. He clenched his jaw and tried to regulate his breaths, but the sight of the watchman disturbed him. He supposed that was to be expected. After all, watchmen were gatekeepers to the afterlife, wraiths who either stole your soul for Shariah or granted you passage into the great unending. Every man and woman feared the watchman's arrival and prayed for mercy when it came. It was the oldest fear among humans, a fear of death, a fear of eternity. I am not human. He held the laser blade in front of him and calmly tossed the severed head of the evil one down the hallway toward the apparition. An offering, he said. The Nuri masters frowned upon open confrontation with the watchmen as they were extraordinarily powerful in the dark arts and quick to anger, but he was not afraid. He could not afford to be. Fear was the great death. Fear cannot exist within the Hydria, Colt's voice assured him. The Hydria are above fear because they are above death. They are death, as they are life. You cannot fear what already exists within you. Circular thought, it seemed to him, circular teaching. But what was the real message, and what was merely the design of the evil one to distract him? A bargain, he continued, forcing his legs to remain steady as he crossed the stones toward the hooded figure. There would be a red mask beneath that hood, he knew, a representation of evil pervading the universe despite the presence of Hydria, in direct enmity to them, in fact. The Hydria existed to oppose the Watchmen, and it was likewise said that the Watchmen existed because of the Hydria. The Nuri taught that they were one and the same, but the declaration befuddled the warrior. Once he'd told his Nuri master as much, how it was like saying that his weapon and his enemy's weapon were one when they sparked against each other on the battlefield. He'd expected a maddeningly vague response from the Nuri master about how all things are one with each other and eternally angling towards communion, which was the sort of extravagant refuse the Czarlites fed to the hapless masses, but the answer had surprised him. It is more like saying ice is solid, liquid, and gas at once, because they are all different states of the same being, good, evil, and apathetic, the three states of existence according to the Nuri. Where will you take me? He asked the watchman. Slowly the hooded figure bent and retrieved the head of the evil one from the floor. carefully brushing blood and dust from the dead thing's horns. By the end of this day, you will know the face of the devil, the watchman growled deeply. Not tricks, not illusions. You will know what it means to have your soul ripped from your body before your eyes. You will see agony. The warrior continued forward unabated, flexing his fingers over the hilt of the laser sword and preparing to attack if necessary. I will know God, he said, drawing the glowing blade over his shoulder for a strike. I am Hidria. The watchman stood to his full imposing height and roared. Baring his teeth and digging his boots into the cracks between stones for purchase, the warrior drove forward until he skirted striking distance, then leapt into the air and slammed the blade down at the hooded creature. The watchman was one step ahead of him, though. Before the laser blade found its target, the abomination fell to the ground and kicked out his right leg with lethal grace. Should have seen that coming. The warrior braced for impact. The blow connected heavily with his sternum, hurling him headfirst to the ceiling before he crashed to the stone floor in a heap. His breath left him again, just as it had when Colt had transported him through deep space. I am not human, he reminded himself as he gasped. Humans need to breathe, but I am not human. He sensed the watchman's heavy, curled fist bearing down on him before it was visible, and spun to his right, driving upward with the laser blade at the same time. Neither blow landed, his nor the watchman's, but that was all right. If there was one thing the cult approached confidently during the trials, it was combat. The most difficult aspect of the vision quest involved finding God amid a never-ending labyrinth of illusion, false prophets, and temptation. In comparison, combat was simple and automatic. As if on cue, a jolt of reflexive manufactured tranquility shot through his body with such fierce determination that he could hardly move. It was the battle calm, a numbness drilled into each of the call from the outset of training so they could stare death in the eye without blinking. This time, however, the shocking serenity that instantly settled his soul far exceeded his considerable combat experience, exceeded even all the Nuri Master had taught him on the windswept mountaintop before he'd known his true self. This was Hidria. This was Colt. The watchman roared and lunged forward, clutching at the warrior's throat, but he easily evaded the attack and recovered well enough to jab the end of the sword through the watchman's stomach. It happened so quickly that the demon set his feet and prepared to strike again before realizing he had been gutted. He growled at the warrior defiantly. Tonight I will see you in Shariah. The warrior withdrew his glowing blade and sliced through the demon's neck in one deft motion. Its head fell noisily to the floor, bouncing once off the stone tiles before rolling to a rest against the wall. You will never see me in Shariah, he told the corpse, because you aren't real. The words were true, at least he believed they were, but unsatisfying nonetheless, as was the creature's death. The fact remained that he had killed another being, no matter the form it had taken to manifest in the trials, and he was still no closer to knowing God. Patience, Colt's voice drifted to him from a shadowed corridor jutting off to the right. To rebuild, you will need to tear down every aspect of yourself. A wisp of smoke twirled over his shoulder and swept down the hallway, beckoning him onward with a sweet smelling memory. You are still human. If he succeeded, he wouldn't be for long. Hydria, he thought. As he understood the term, it was a state of being paradoxically superior to humans through its subservience to humanity. A position of no power which necessitated great power. Access to anything and everything one's hearts could desire, yet lacking the capacity for desire. An executioner who eschewed violence. Hydria, God's great paradox. Not human, he told himself. I am not human. He couldn't imagine the words ever being true. Pressing the switch to retract his blade, the warrior followed Colt's essence down the hall. Distractions enticed him from every wooden doorway they passed. Castle chambers lit with blue flames where monsters and abominations dwelled. Marble fountains of exquisite beauty overflowing with spiced wine and glacial cascades of honey. Patients awaiting appointments with physicians, accountants, or politicians. All distractions, irrelevant, human. You still have a long way to go, Colt repeated, so he followed her without looking back.
Wow, thank you very much. That's an intense reading. I have a question about this. Where did you, when you're writing the rough draft, as we all go through several drafts when we're writing, how did you make the decision where to draw the line between science fiction and religion? How far did you initially when you were writing the draft, how far did you want to push that boundary?
Well, I had this notion, basically this book was a spiritual journey for me, trying to figure out, where my beliefs landed and, what I agreed with about some churches that I had attended and some
Right.
questions that I had. And I write science fiction generally, so I was drawn to the idea. I think of God as a universal concept, not an earthly concept. And that I, I've always thought about the way that if we encounter aliens, my idea is that they would share a God with us. If we believe in one, if you believe in one God that created everything, then from a science fiction perspective,
Then
you-
everything is
and
everything,
everything
right?
was everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the same God would have created all beings and all planets. And that's so to me, the question of God lends itself to science fiction because it's such a universal concept.
So
It's
there's this idea
universe.
of commonality even with extraterrestrials.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's a very cool thing. What was the most difficult part for you about writing this book?
Honestly, the first few chapters that I just read, because after that it kind of takes a step back and slows down a little bit. But I really wanted to capture the disorientation that this warrior would feel being thrust into this situation. And so it may not, the first two chapters are probably the least accessible in the book, in that they're disorienting and they kind of are repetitive with certain phrases and things like that. But so it's kind of trying to strike that balance of still trying to hook people in, and while at the same time going for the disorientation that I felt was necessary to kind of cast doubt on whether this is really happening, or if it's a vision, or if it's induced by the drugs or that he took for the sacred trials, or what's really happening. So that was a difficult line for me to draw. And then later in the book, trying to determine how, if and when he does encounter God, how is that represented? And
Yeah.
so that was
I
that
can
was a
imagine that would
difficult.
definitely be a challenge to write.
Yes, absolutely. So those were the most difficult aspects for me.
That's very cool. I like how you dropped us immediately into the action of the story. So I'm excited to read this book. I think it's going to be a great read. Thank you so much for coming on the program and sharing your work with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
I look forward to having you back again.
Great, great. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.